The morning I turned 18, I was already gone before my mother poured her first cup of coffee, and every single dollar my dead father left me was locked inside a vault she would never touch. My name is Evelyn Dalton, and I grew up inside a lie so beautiful it had marble floors and a rooftop terrace overlooking Lake Michigan and a mother who smelled like Chanel No. 5 and fresh betrayal. We lived in the kind of Chicago neighborhood where nobody asks where the money comes from because the money is everywhere, in the crown molding, in the private school tuitions, in the quiet, terrible way my mother Lydia Dalton could make a room go cold just by walking into it. I was 17 years old when I started figuring things out, and I was 17 years and 11 months when I decided I was done being figured out myself. My father, Reginald Dalton, died when I was 14, and it was a brain aneurysm. Fast and clean, and no warning at all. He was a real estate developer, the old Chicago money kind, not the flashy Instagram kind. And when he died, he left behind 3 properties and a portfolio worth close to $4 million, and a handwritten note that his attorney, a quiet man named Fowler, read to me alone in a back office 3 years after the funeral. The note said, "Evie, wait until you're 18, then go see Fowler alone. Don't bring your mother." I didn't understand it then, but I do now because my father knew something I was still learning. Here's the part nobody tells you about growing up rich and motherless. Motherless in spirit, I mean, because Lydia was physically present every single day, filling our penthouse with her opinions and her dinner parties and her rotating cast of close friends, who always seemed to be men between 35 and 55 who drove foreign cars and laughed too loudly at her jokes. I went to see Fowler alone the week before my birthday, and he slid a folder across his desk and watched me read it without saying a single word. My father had been meticulous, and he had restructured his estate 18 months before he died. Not because he knew he was dying, Fowler told me quietly, but because he had started worrying. About what Fowler wouldn't say directly, but the documents said enough. Every asset had been placed into a trust that would activate at my 18th birthday, and I was the sole beneficiary, and my mother was not a trustee, and she was not named anywhere. And here was the thing that made my blood go ice cold right there in that leather chair. There was a secondary clause. If I chose within 30 days of my birthday to transfer trust management to a secondary fiduciary, which Fowler himself was designated as, my mother would have zero legal pathway to contest or claim or access a single cent. Daddy hadn't just left me money, he'd left me armor. So 2 days before my birthday, I sat in Fowler's office for 3 hours and signed every document he put in front of me, and I transferred management, and I locked the trust, and I made it irrevocable, and I went home and ate birthday cake with my mother like nothing had happened at all. The next morning, she smiled at me over her coffee cup, that slow, practiced smile she used when she was about to say something that required performance, and said, "We need to talk about that money." My blood ran cold, but my face did nothing. I had been waiting for that sentence for 4 years, and let me tell you something. When you've been waiting for a knife, it doesn't hurt the same way when it finally comes out. "What money?" I said, and I even tilted my head a little, like a girl who didn't know a single thing about estate law or irrevocable trusts, or the fact that her father had been quietly building a wall between his daughter and his wife for the last 2 years of his life. Lydia set her cup down, and she had the kind of face that photographers loved, angular and bone-structured, and eternally 43. Even though she was 51, and she arranged it now into something that was meant to look like maternal concern, but landed closer to corporate strategy. "Your father's estate," she said. "Now that you're 18, there are some decisions that need to be made. Together, as a family. That phrase, there were only 2 of us, and we were the family, and she was using it like a crowbar. "I thought Fowler handled everything I said. Fowler handles the paperwork," she said. "I handled the family. I watched her, and I had been watching her my whole life, cataloging the small performances and the micro adjustments, the way she leaned forward when she was lying, and the way she touched her left wrist when she was nervous, and the way she never once in my memory said, "I love you," without wanting something immediately afterward. My therapist, Dr. Ingram, had a clinical word for what Lydia was, but I just called her Mom. "Sure," I said, "we can talk, but here's what she didn't know. What she couldn't have known, what I had made absolutely sure of. The money was already gone into the trust and gone behind a legal door she had no key to. And the reason I had moved it so fast, and the reason I had walked into Fowler's office with a printout of Illinois trust law. I'd been studying for 6 months. That reason was a name. A name I had found in my father's private email account 3 weeks after he died when I was 14 years old and still stupid enough to think grief was the worst thing a family could survive. The name was Soren Vale. I didn't know who Soren Vale was at 14, and I just knew the name appeared in dozens of emails between my father and someone whose address I didn't recognize. A secondary account my father used that wasn't connected to his main profile. The emails were about money and about transfers and about property that was being moved without my mother's knowledge, and about a deal that had gone wrong, and about fear. My father was afraid of something in those emails, and the name Soren Vale sat at the center of every single one like a stone dropped in still water I bookmarked. The account, and I checked it for years. And then 6 months before my birthday, a new email appeared, and it was from my mother's personal address, the one she used for yoga classes and brunch reservations, and it was sent to that same secondary account of my father's, which made 0 sense unless she knew about it, unless she'd always known the subject line was, "She's almost 18, we need to move." I read it 4 times, and then I closed the laptop and walked to the bathroom and ran the sink so she wouldn't hear me, and stood there gripping the porcelain until my knuckles went white. We, my mother and someone or something called Soren Vale, moving on a timeline tied to my birthday, my inheritance. I want you to understand something about me. I am not a dramatic person, and I don't yell and I don't cry in front of people. I got all of that from my father, who built an empire by being the calmest person in every room. What I am is patient, and what I am is prepared. And what I am, as of that morning over coffee, is 3 steps ahead of a woman who had underestimated me since the day I was born. The next 2 weeks were a performance, and I let Lydia talk about the money, and I nodded and said things like that. Makes sense. And I'll think about that while she laid out what she called a family investment strategy, which, when I listened carefully, was essentially a plan to consolidate the trust assets into a joint account that she would co-manage. She said it was about protecting me and about making sure I didn't make young person mistakes, and she said my father would have wanted this, my father who specifically and deliberately kept her off every document, and who left me an attorney and a note and a lock, and who was apparently afraid enough of something 4 years ago to restructure everything before a brain aneurysm took him out at 56. I smiled and nodded and let her talk, and I started digging into Soren Vale. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about my family, and I mean everything. Not just the money and not just the estate, but the entire architecture of my childhood and the whole story. I'd been told about who we were and how we got here. When I tell you the truth about Soren Vale, you are not going to believe me, but every single word is documented, and every single word is in the folder I keep in Fowler's office in a sealed envelope with my signature across the seal. His name was not actually Soren Vale, and that was a business alias. A name tied to an LLC registered in Delaware with no physical address and no verifiable owner. But LLCs have registered agents, and registered agents have paper trails, and paper trails have names on them if you know where to look and you've spent your senior year of high school learning to look instead of attending pep rallies. The registered agent for Sorenvale LLC was a firm in downtown Chicago, and that firm's client roster, partially visible through a public court filing from 2019, included a name I recognized immediately. Not a man I'd never heard of, and not some stranger, but someone who had been eating dinner at our table for the last 6 years. Someone my mother had introduced as her investment advisor back when I was 12. Someone who drove a black Range Rover and always held eye contact about 30 seconds longer than was normal, and once told me at a charity gala where I was 15 and bored and half listening that smart women don't ask too many questions. His name was Thaddeus Crane, and as of my mother's last tax return, which I had photographed from the filing cabinet in her home office on a Tuesday afternoon while she was at Pilates, he was listed as a co-owner of the LLC that held the mortgage on our penthouse. The penthouse my dead father had owned outright. Let me say that again so it lands properly. The apartment I grew up in, the one my father bought in cash in 2003, the one that should have been part of his estate, and the one that should have been in that trust, it had a mortgage on it. A mortgage that didn't exist when my father was alive, and a mortgage held by a company that was secretly owned by my mother's boyfriend. I sat in my bedroom that night with the documents spread across my bed, and I thought about my father in those last 2 years, sending scared emails to a secret account and restructuring everything and writing a note to his 14-year-old daughter and telling her not to bring her mother. I thought about a man who had built a life and felt it being slowly dismantled while he was still in it, and I thought about whether he knew about Thaddeus Crane, and I thought about whether the aneurysm was really just an aneurysm. And then I stopped thinking because that road was one I wasn't ready to walk down. Not yet. What I was ready for was the next move. I had the trust locked, and I had the documents, and I had Fowler, and I had something else. Something I'd been quietly building for 3 months with the help of a woman named Priya. Priya was a financial forensics consultant in her 40s who lived 6 blocks from us and who had been my father's college roommate's wife, and who had reached out to me the previous spring with a single text that said, "Your father asked me to check on you when you turned 18. I think you should call me." I called her the same day. Priya had been building a file on Sorenvale LLC and Thaddeus Crane for 11 months, and she was not doing it for money. She was doing it because she had loved my father like a brother, and because she had met Thaddeus Crane once 3 years ago at a function and recognized what he was, within 10 minutes. "Your mother isn't the villain here," Priya told me over coffee the week before my birthday. Her voice careful and level. "She's a participant, but she's not the architect." "Then who is?" I asked. Priya looked at me for a long moment and said, "That is what we're about to find out." And that, right there, that pause, and that look, and that sentence, was the moment I understood that this was not just about my inheritance. This was not just about a mortgage or an LLC or a man who held eye contact too long. This was about something that started before I was born, and something my father spent the last years of his life running from, and something that had a name I hadn't found yet. The money was safe, but the truth was still out there, and it was ugly. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes over a woman when she has stopped being afraid and started being strategic, and they found that quiet somewhere between my 19th birthday and the morning I walked into a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a building on Michigan Avenue with a manila folder and a flash drive, and Priya sitting 3 chairs to my right, like a loaded weapon in a blazer. By the time I was 19, I had spent a full year learning the shape of what had been done to my family. Priya was meticulous, and she documented everything in layers the way an archaeologist works, carefully and not disturbing what was underneath until she was certain she understood the layers she was on. She had been a forensic accountant for 20 years before she moved into consulting, and she did not miss things. And what she had found piece by piece over the course of those 11 months was a scheme so carefully constructed that I genuinely paused sometimes just to appreciate the architecture of it. The way you might pause to look at a beautiful building before you blow it up. Here's the part where it gets ugly, and here's the part where it stops being about money and starts being about who my mother actually was, and what she had chosen over and over for 20 years in the dark, where she thought nobody was watching. Thaddeus Crane was not an investment advisor. He had a license, a real one bought legitimately, but his actual business, the one that had been operating quietly for nearly 2 decades, was what the attorney who would later explain it to a federal investigator called predatory estate repositioning. In plain language, he identified wealthy families where one spouse had significantly more assets than the bold's other and cultivated a relationship with the asset-poorer spouse, and then through a combination of fraudulent business arrangements and forged or manipulated legal documents and what Priya described with clinical precision as sustained psychological grooming, systematically moved assets out of the estate and into entities he controlled. By the time the target died or divorced or otherwise became unable to fight back, the money was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with his name on it or close enough to his name that the distance was only a legal technicality. He had done it 4 times before my father, and it was 4 families and 4 wealthy Chicago husbands, and 3 of them had died, and 1 had committed suicide. None of it had ever been successfully prosecuted because each time the wife was willing to testify that everything had been consensual and that she had understood and agreed to every transaction, and that her late husband had been unstable or paranoid or difficult. Crane never left a fingerprint that couldn't be explained, and he was a ghost who wore a blazer and drove a clean car and always found a woman who was lonely enough and hungry enough and angry enough at her husband to open the door. My mother had opened the door when I was 8 years old. 8 years old. I did the math sitting in Priya's kitchen with a cold cup of tea in my hands, and I understood that every birthday party and every school pickup and every Sunday morning, my parents sat at opposite ends of the breakfast table in civil silence. All of it had been happening inside something I didn't have a name for yet. My mother had not been a bystander in her own betrayal. She had been a volunteer. But here is the thing about Priya's file that separated it from everything that had combined for in every case where Crane had walked clean. Priya had found the emails, not the sanitized ones, and not the carefully worded business correspondences that could be explained away, but the real ones. The ones Crane had kept on a private server because he was arrogant enough to think they'd never surface. How Priya found them is a story I'll tell another time because it involves a disgruntled former employee of Crane's firm and a flash drive and a decision made in a parking garage at 2 a.m. that was, legally speaking, in a gray area I have chosen not to examine too closely. What matters is what was in them. What was in them was a timeline, a deliberate and documented step-by-step plan stretching back 16 years to drain my father's estate. What was in them was my mother writing to Crane in her own words, describing my father's suspicions and telling Crane which accounts he was monitoring and helping Crane stay ahead of whatever my father was figuring out. What was in them was a conversation dated 11 months before my father died, in which my mother wrote, "R is getting closer. The trust thing is a real problem. We need to move faster." And Crane wrote back, "Let me handle it. Stay calm. I always handle it." My father died 7 months later. I have sat with that for a long time, and I have sat with the question that lives inside those emails like a lit match. I have talked to Priya about it and to Fowler and to the investigator who was eventually assigned to the case, and not one of them will tell me definitively what they believe. I believe What I have always believed deep in the part of me that is still 14 and standing at a graveside in the November cold is that my father was not just robbed. But I cannot prove it, and I have learned slowly and painfully that justice and truth are not always the same room. What I could prove was fraud, grand and multi-layered and federally prosecutable fraud. Priya had been working with a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit for 4 months by the time she brought me fully into the loop, and they had been building the case from their end. What they needed, what would transform a solid case into an airtight one, was a cooperating witness with access to the family's financial history from the inside. They needed someone who could sit across from a federal prosecutor and provide context and documents and testimony that established the timeline and the motive from the victim's side of the table. They needed me. I said yes before Priya finished the sentence. Now here's what I want you to understand about what came next, because I know how. These stories usually go, and this one goes differently. I was not angry in the way that destroys you and I had been through. That anger, and I'd lived in it for years, and I'd cried into pillows about it, and I'd sat in Dr. Ingram's office and untangled it thread by thread. And by the time the moment came, I was not a girl running on emotion. I was my father's daughter. I was the calmest person in every room. I kept living at home for 3 more months, and I kept having coffee with my mother, and I kept nodding while she talked about the investment strategy and kept saying things like, "I'm still thinking about it, and I want to make sure I understand everything properly first." I kept watching Thaddeus Crane come to dinner twice a month, and watching him sit at the table where my father used to sit, and watching him refill my mother's wine glass with that particular practiced ease that had probably worked on her for 16 years. I watched him look at me sometimes with a calculation behind his eyes that I recognized now for exactly what it was. He was assessing whether I was a problem. He had decided I wasn't, and he had decided I was distracted. 19-year-old girl with access to money I didn't know how to protect, and he had decided to be patient. That was his last mistake. The morning it happened, I was not there, and Priya had told me firmly that I should not be present, and I had agreed, because I understood that my being present would make it about drama instead of justice, and I wanted it to be about justice. I was at Fowler's office sitting in that same leather chair where I had first read my father's trust documents when Priya texted me a single word: done. Federal agents arrested Thaddeus Crane at his office on a Tuesday at 9:15 in the morning, and he was charged with wire fraud and money laundering and conspiracy to commit estate fraud. The indictment named 4 additional victims whose families had spent years not knowing what had happened to them. The charges against my mother were separate and negotiated and brutal in a quieter way. She cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced sentence because by then she understood finally and completely in the cold light of a federal holding room that she had been used to. Not as brutally as my father and not as irreversibly, but used. Crane had never loved her, and he had never intended to, and she was a tool with excellent cheekbones and access to a wealthy husband, and the moment her usefulness was gone, he would have repositioned her the same way he'd repositioned everything else. I saw my mother once before the sentencing, and she asked to see me through. Fowler and I said yes because I needed to close something and because she was still my mother, even though that word had been reshaped by everything I now knew into something smaller and stranger than it used to be. She looked tired, and she looked 60, in a way she had never allowed herself to look before, as if the performance that had held the years back had finally been turned off at the power source. She sat across from me in a conference room and said, "I told myself I was doing it for us, for our stability, for your future." She paused and then said, "That's not true. I was doing it because I was angry at your father for being everything I couldn't control and Thaddeus. made me feel like the powerful one for the first time in my life, and I let that feeling cost everything. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "He was afraid of you. At the end, did you know that? Not of Crane, of you." She looked at the table. "Yeah," I said, "I know." I stood up and left, and I did not look back, not because I was done feeling things about it, since I would be feeling things about it for the rest of my life, but because I had said what I needed to say, and staying longer would have been for her benefit and not mine, and I was done doing things for her benefit. Here's where the story shifts, and here is where the girl who moved her money in the dark gets to step into the light. Because after the arrest and after the federal case began and the property, liens were filed, and the news cycle picked up the story and dropped it and picked it up again. After all of that, I had a decision to make about what happened next. Not with the money which Priya and Fowler had already been carefully and methodically restoring to its proper place, but with me and with what I built out of the ruins of everything I'd been handed. I enrolled at Northwestern in the spring, deferred a year, and used the time well. I studied finance and law because Priya had shown me that the two together were the most powerful combination available to a person who intended to make sure what happened to my father never happened to anyone else without consequence. I kept Fowler as my attorney and brought Priya on as a formal advisor. I set up a foundation in my father's name, the Reginald Dalton Financial Protection Fund, that provided legal and forensic resources to families who suspected they were being defrauded but couldn't afford the expertise to prove it. The federal case against Crane, once fully prosecuted, would result in asset seizures and a portion of those seized assets, through a restitution agreement that Priya had quietly negotiated as part of the cooperation deal, came back to the families who had been victimized, including mine, and including the families of the 3 men who had died, and including the widow of the man who had not. Crane was sentenced to 19 years. He stood in that courtroom in his expensive suit and received the sentence with the same measured composure he had probably brought to every room for 20 years, and I sat in the gallery and watched him. And I felt not triumph exactly, but something quieter. Something more like the feeling of a window finally being opened in a room that has been closed for a very long time. People ask me sometimes how I knew and how a 17-year-old figured out what trained professionals and grieving adults had missed. And I always say the same thing. I didn't know, I just paid attention. I paid attention to my father's fear, and I paid attention to my mother's performance, and I paid attention to the way a man I was never supposed to suspect held eye contact. Contact a beat too long and told me that smart women don't ask too many questions. I asked every question, and I asked them quietly and methodically over years in the places where nobody was, watching a teenage girl do her homework. That's all it was. Attention and patience, and a father who loved me enough to leave me the door even when he wasn't there to walk through it with me. The penthouse sold 8 months after the legal proceedings concluded, and I didn't want to live there anymore, and I'm not sure I ever really wanted to live there, or if I had just been living in the beautiful, expensive stage set of someone else's story. The proceeds went back into the trust properly this time, with clean titles and clear documentation, and not a single name on them that shouldn't be there. I moved to a smaller place in Lincoln Park, 2nd floor, an exposed brick and a window in the kitchen that faces east so I get the morning light. It is the first place I have ever lived that feels like mine. Not my father's legacy, and not my mother's performance, and not Thaddeus Crane's long con. Mine. I keep my father's handwritten note in a frame on the bookshelf. "Evie, wait until you're 18. Then go see Fowler alone. Don't bring your mother." It's the most fatherly thing he ever said to me, and he said it from beyond the grave in 6 lines on legal stationery, which feels exactly right for a real estate developer who trusted documents more than words. My mother received 3 years of supervised probation and permanent financial oversight, and she lives in a condo in Evanston now. We talk sometimes and not often, and not warmly, but we talk, which is more than I thought I would be able to say, and less than she hoped. I have made my peace with the distance. Some people love their children the way they love furniture, as things that belong in a room, that should stay where they're put, and that should not rearrange themselves without permission. My mother loved me that way, and I have decided it was the most she had to give, and I have decided that is not my problem to fix. What is mine to carry is this. My father saw something coming, and he could not stop it, but he refused to let it take everything. He built a door and put my name on the lock, and I walked through it. That's the whole story, and that's all of it. He protected me the only way he had left, and I finished what he started.
Take a moment to comment your city or country. I love connecting with you all. Thank you for listening and supporting, and be sure to subscribe for more stories. More are coming your way soon. Until next time, stay kind to yourself and stay strong.